Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm also a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast today is Tomás Villalón. Tomás, he'll talk about his background a little bit on the podcast, but he's on our innovation advisory board here at CI. And before we dive into the episode, I just want to give you some brief background on some of the things that we're doing at CI and why people like Tomás and Miles, who was on a couple months ago, why they're making their appearances here. You know me as a geopolitical expert, and this podcast is all about geopolitics. But one of our big theses is that if we're moving towards a world that is more multipolar, and if we're moving towards an energy revolution that moves away from hydrocarbons in favor of some yet to be determined renewable, and I think those renewables might be different based on different geographic regions of the world, but if we have this move towards multipolarity and a general energy revolution, you're going to get tremendous innovation in the economy, innovation like we haven't seen for many decades. And I can show you, and we've written a white paper at CI, and we're investing along these principles, that the relationship is there between geopolitics and innovation. I was just doing some reading over the weekend and was reading about, I knew this already, but reminded myself about, the first discovery of things like nitrates was not for fertilizer, it was for ammunition in World War I. The entire modern agricultural complex is based on science and research and development that was made for ammunition in World War I, not because people had this idea that they were going to create fertilizers. The other example, I've used this on the podcast before, is that the reason the U.S. became the real beginning of the global semiconductor industry was not because, yes, it was because of U.S. innovation and because of all these other things, but it wasn't because of an innately capitalist system. It was because the U.S. government decided to become the largest and first customer for semiconductors because you needed semiconductors to make their missiles more accurate, and they wanted to be able to strike missile sites in the Soviet Union more accurately. So the chips that allow you to listen to this podcast, that allow me to record it here in New Orleans and you can listen to it anywhere else in the world, it all has its origins in geopolitics and the Cold War in the 1950s. And because we are in that sort of flux, it's that concentric circle, imagine, where geopolitics and innovation come together, where we think the exponential disruptive opportunities are. So we have a CI research platform. We've talked about the knowledge platform. One of those knowledge platforms is a geopolitical knowledge platform, and it includes access to all of the information and data and analysis that we're gathering on a daily basis. And there are certainly options where you can have, one-on-one time with me every quarter and every month. But we also have an innovation platform. And that has people like Tomás, like Miles, other analysts on our innovation advisory board and also at CI who are treating innovation the exact same way I treat geopolitics. So they are looking for those tech developments that you probably don't even know are happening, but that are going to change the world 3, 5, 10 years from now. Geopolitics can really set the stage, I think, for where innovation goes, but innovation is also an input here. All it takes is one scientific discovery to completely change the way geopolitics works. A good example of this, and this was on the CI innovation platform a couple of weeks ago, there was a report that some Chinese academics they had a study that showed that maybe there was some viability for a sodium-ion battery rather than a lithium-ion battery. Now, very nascent stages, it's initial research, etc. But just imagine if researchers were able to make a sodium-ion battery viable. Then suddenly the entire conversation about electric vehicles and about lithium and the lithium triangle in South America and Mexico nationalizing lithium, that all goes poof. It all changes in an instant. And I'm not a scientist. I'm smart enough to know, though, that you need to be talking to scientists. You need to be talking about where research and development are going because it's those changes that are actually going to drive where things go, and then geopolitics is going to be the input that is pushing back and forth. So again, Rob and I mentioned this in a podcast about a week and a half ago. Our money's where our mouth is here. We're looking at innovation and geopolitics as the things that are going to describe real disruptive change. It's our CI innovation strategy is our main growth strategy for our clients because we want our clients to be able to be exposed to these developments, to be exposed to the companies that over a 5-10 year time horizon are going to do better than all others because they are correctly positioned with those major trends. We're looking for Standard Oil as if it's 1890. We're looking for Texas Instruments and Intel as if it's 1950. That is the kind of opportunity that is out there. So whether you want to talk more about wealth management and about the ways that we apply these insights to actually translating returns in our investor portfolios, if you want access to some of those research platforms that I just talked about, you can let me know too, or you can continue to enjoy the podcast and just get a little taste, a little tip of the iceberg about the level of work and research that goes into all the things that we're doing and sharing with you here today. Either way, happy to have you here. My email address is jacob@cognitive.investments, and no further plugs. Let's get on to this fascinating episode with Tomás. Cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right, Tomás, we've been trying to do this for a while, and mostly because I've been sucking at scheduling lately, we haven't been able to do it. I'm really happy to make the time.
No, thank you for the time, Jacob. Great listening to, all your talks earlier, and super excited to talk about metals and smelting.
Yeah, let's talk about metals. Why don't we start by tell the listeners what you do. What is your day job when you're not here talking to me on podcasts?
Yeah, happy to do so. My name is Tomás Villalón, co-founder, CTO of a startup in the mining and metallurgy space called Phoenix Tailings. And so basically, my job is to figure out how to make metals cleanly, look at the infrastructure, figure out how to put processes together, and just understand the metals ecosystem. It's a very confusing one when you get to certain aspects of it because the markets aren't really clear and opaque. So it's finding all those little niches and the technologies that underlie them.
I feel like raw materials in general have always been somewhat geopolitical. I mean, we're recording here Monday, June 5th. This will come out in a week. But today the news is, OPEC and specifically Saudi Arabia cut production figures, which is to say, metals, raw materials, all these things have been geopolitical for a long time. But unlike, say, hydrocarbons and energy sources, I feel like metals in some ways have embodied they're in some ways the platonic ideal of globalization. You get mined from somewhere over here, and then you send it over to China for refining or processing, and then it goes to Japan if you want to make this, or the United States if you want to make this, and it's this very lean global supply chain. And the question I wanted to lead off with is, when did that start to change for metals, or has that already changed? Is it not changed quickly enough yet? Because when you look at the United States government talking about critical materials, you look at everybody's talking about, we have to nearshore and get new sources of supply for all these different metals we're used to just getting leanly and cheaply from other places. When did that start to change from your perspective, or has it changed meaningfully?
That's a really fascinating question. So there's two answers that I'll give to that. And so on a high level, probably within the past decade or so, when rare earths and certain critical materials really began to kick off. A great benchmark is when the Critical Materials Institute was made in the US. That was like the first bastion of, if you will, of we don't have access to these things necessarily anymore. So that was like the first bunch of efforts. And then, fun fact, in my startup, we started just as COVID happened. And so, we're this tiny group and, 500 square feet in a lab in, the suburbs of Boston, and the phones were just ringing off the hook. It went from, we could not get anyone to speak with us for 6 months to, okay, we've got 6 multinational corporations who want to speak with us in the next 48 hours. It was night and day. And seeing how the themes changed as well. It's like, whoa, what does it take to bring it back here? All of a sudden these supply chains aren't as secure as we thought it was. And it's been generally accepted that, to your point, you mine in South America, you refine in Japan, your final product gets made in South Korea or the US. But that's really begun to change since COVID, because now at the end of the day, what everyone seems to really care about is how good is my supply? How consistently can I keep it moving? Because if I don't have it, like the car companies found out, they're a great example. You can't even make cars even if you want to.
Yeah, it's interesting you say 2020 is sort of the benchmark for it, because in geopolitical land, I feel like people started talking about this as a theme and even as an investment theme around 2009, 2010. And it's when China and Japan have that spat, territorial dispute, ships in the wrong sea, blah, blah, blah. And China basically says we're going to cut off rare earth elements to Japan, and then suddenly everybody starts thinking about it. You get, I forget what the name of the U.S. company was, but there's the mine in Mountain Pass that has the rare earth elements, and everybody starts talking about this, and you get these boom cycles and bust cycles. And I remember I was fresh out of college at that point, and I had asked my then girlfriend's she had an uncle or something who was an economic advisor, and I asked him, well, what should I put my paltry savings in? And he was like, I'd buy this rare metals ETF. By the way, that was a really bad decision. At least from the geopolitics perspective, I feel like that was the kind of moment, but it's taken a long time, I think, for industry to catch up to rare earths have been used in that particular way since 2010.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating you bring those points out, right? Because if we think about the problem in a mine's time scale, that is actually more or less how it works, on the order of decades to 2 decades. So let's give a kind of a general statistic, right? 10 to 20 years from original ideation to drilling, to getting all the clearances, to getting to operation. We're not even talking life of mine. We're just talking getting the thing open. On top of that too, one complicating factor that's occurring more and more is water rights and also land rights, especially in either disputed and or multi-governance zones. So there's a really good example of this going on right now. It's in Arizona. It's called the Restitution Mine, if I'm not mistaken. And, not the Restitution, the Resolution Mine, excuse me. And they've been working on this since 2008. And they're just about to break ground. And they've had multiple potential governance lawsuits thrown at them because of the Native American tribes that are in the area. And they've been working with them for the better part of 10 years, and something went south. So now all of a sudden, the whole project, which is up to 25% of the U.S.'s copper supply, is now stalled out again. And this is after $2 billion worth of investment. So it gets hairy very quickly.
Well, and this is one of those areas where history really isn't ancient history. I think a lot of people in the United States, rightfully so, talk about China and its treatment of its ethnic minorities and its Uyghur minorities and things like that. And I'm not in any way whitewashing that or approving that. But China's rejoinder is usually, really, you're one to talk? Do you see what you did in your history to African Americans and Native Americans and things like that? And to your point, are still doing? Because I guarantee you that if the U.S. government finds lots of these critical materials in the few reservations that are left to Native, they will figure out how to get those minerals out. And they may try the nice way first, but if things get critical enough, I assume that the United States will kind of go in there and bulldoze any opposition. But to your point, here, metals, energy, you go across the gamut. This is another problem in the United States. There is so much bureaucratic red tape that you can't, things that used to take a short amount of time to build take forever to build. They're replacing some water pipes here on a street in New Orleans that I used to bike down to get to the pool. They've been doing it for literally six months now. They say it's going to take another 8 months. I get low water pressure in my house every other weekend because they're doing. Anyway, I'm rambling a little bit there, but which is just to say, I feel like some part of the metals conversation is just about the people who are unlucky enough to be on the land that people want to exploit, and that continues in the United States to this day.
Well, it's a really interesting point you brought up, comparing energy and mining, because as far as I'm concerned at this point, they're one and the same, right? So instead of big oil, you now have big shovel. And the statistic that I heard that I think really puts things into context is that, we're trying to electrify the entire grid. We're trying to move away from hydrocarbons, but to replace 1 pound of hydrocarbon requires 6 pounds of metals and materials. Mm-hmm. So you are going green, but it comes at the expense of infrastructure. It comes at the expense of getting all of the materials out. And if we look over the course of human history, how we've refined these metals and materials, there's a really great book by Pliny the Elder that actually describes how the Romans made copper. And it hasn't changed. Instead of oxen, we now have electric motors. And instead of, the random vats of alchemic ether, we now have sulfuric acid, but the process is fundamentally the same. And that's actually one of the huge limiting factors now, is that we want to keep growing these facilities because the demand is just astronomical for some of these things. But we've been making it the same way for 2,000 plus years. And well, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and all the other fun emissions are now becoming a pretty big problem at the end of the day. So to reach our green targets, we just don't have to think about the mining itself. It's also the refining, because what good is a material if you cannot actually make it into a metal? Or even more so from the geopolitical context, what good is it if I have to ship everything external and then re-import it back in? And when you look at the list of critical materials, there's a handful that sneak in. It's like, oh yeah, no, we've got this. It's like, well, we've got it in the ground, but I'm not sure we can actually do anything with it once we pull it out of the ground.
You kind of blew my mind when you said we're not like really refining copper any different than the Romans did like thousands of years ago. But to your point, we've had Gary Golden on this podcast a few times, and we've talked about the difference between electrification and decarbonization, and he's really trained me to think in terms of decarbonization versus electrification, because I'm not sure if the math really works with electrification. And you're exactly right that there is no real difference between energy and mining on a certain level. I've been slowly plotting my way recently through Václav Smil's Fossil Energy and Civilization History, which if you're looking, it's really amazing. The front note says that Bill Gates said about this book, "I wait for new Smil books the way people wait for the next Star Wars movie." That's got to be a lie, because it's extremely erudite and very, very interesting. But if he really, I feel that way about Robert Caro books, but this thing, anyway, it's very dense. But one of the sort of points of the book is, as you drive down the cost of energy, then you can use cheap energy for lots of different things, including the manufacture of metals. Like, you get this huge takeoff in industry because you're able to drive down the cost of energy. And if suddenly the price of energy is going to go up, or you're going to have displacement or changes in the energy mix, obviously things with metals are going to change. And another thing that really stood out to me that I wanted to ask you about, and what I was reading over the weekend in this book, and I have it in front of me because it said, even in 2014, steel production was 20 times larger than the combined total output of aluminum, copper, zinc, and lead, all of which are important metals that are going to go into, as you said, all of these ESG, decarbonization, electrification, whatever your, pick your pleasure sort of there in general. And I guess the next question I wanted to ask you was, well, do you think steel is going to be as important in the 2000s as it has been so far in the Industrial Revolution? Or do you think that there's another metal or group of metals that you think are really going to be the metal that tells us like how successful modern industrial society is going to be here over the next century?
Man, you're pulling out some real good ones here. So
people don't come on the podcast, Tomás, to get easy questions from me. I'm trying, and you happen to have an expertise in a topic that I've been desperate to find an expert about, and so few people can actually talk about. So I've got more curveballs coming. So just get ready.
Sweet. So there's two classes, I would say. The first is your structural materials, and then the second is I'll call them your electric materials or your electrification materials. In terms of structural, we're not getting rid of steel anytime soon. How do I know this? When you look at the list of critical materials from around the world, I'll use the US and the EU as a good comparison. There are some similarities, and these are the obvious ones. Your rare earths, your platinum group metals, graphite, magnesium, tungsten. Like, these are ones that people generally agree, like, yeah, they're pretty hard to get, pretty hard to refine. But there's a really interesting one that pops up that shows up on the EU's list: coking coal. Well, coking coal really only has one huge use, and that's to make steel. You can use it for other metals. There are specialty applications, but the bulk volume of it is specifically dedicated to steel. Well, if the EU has that on the critical materials list, you're not going to be getting rid of that anytime soon. So that's kind of the structural side of it. Steel is not going away. Where I see a lot more transformation, where I see a lot more development, are on these exotic elements that you've never even heard of. Your neodymiums, your dysprosiums, your scandiums, something like antimony even. Because we're developing new semiconductors, we're developing new electronic devices that have that higher level of efficiency. But in order to get to that level of efficiency, now you're having to use materials that never really had an application before. So, as dumb as it sounds, arsenic is a critical material. We need it for really high-end semiconductors. That's its main application. And the US and the EU import all of the arsenic. We've got the reserves. Funny enough, I know of one deposit in Idaho where cobalt and arsenic occur in the same deposit. They don't want to go after it though, because primarily no one wants to deal with the arsenic. So you're stuck with, Roman era tech, if you will, in a way, trying to solve modern problems. So there's this big disconnect that's starting to occur within the industry where it's like, we have to keep our margins up, we have to keep the company afloat, but we're getting pulled in this direction that is pulling on these materials, and we need the R&D, and the research and development in the US for mining basically stopped when the Bureau of Mines closed in the early 90s, and by that point it was a vestige of what it used to be. So the funding and the push is kicking back in, but the efforts driving it now are external. So you're seeing this push-pull between all the different groups. And then, to go back into your field, people have a vested interest in keeping these technologies and keeping the materials. Indonesia, for instance, as you probably are aware of, they're looking to vertically integrate their entire nickel industry because they have the deposit. Why would they want to sell the material off and not get the extra add value from developing all the batteries that they can make out of them?
What is sort of what is the time scale that the United States has to compete here? And do you really think the United States is going to become a mining power again here? Do you think that that's the trajectory that we're on?
Good question. Mining, possibly. It has a lot of internal hurdles to overcome. You brought up a great point where the U.S. as a whole has, laws on the books and a bureaucratic structure from the 1800s. If you speak to people around the world, the U.S. isn't the greatest place to mine, maybe for the junior miners, but for the majors, it's a bit of a headache just because of all the bureaucracy. That being said, though, there is push in the White House to start ameliorating this because, hey, we want our lithium, we want our nickel, we need all of this. Well, we have the reserves. It's just getting to them. Where I see a bigger push being made is actually on the refining side. We've got a ton of startups right now in the lithium space because the lithium market is just so hot. And, our reserves compared to Australia, Chile, and Argentina, they're okay. But if you can extract it efficiently, then the dollars and cents will continue to roll because you've got, again, the full vertical integration that really brings value to that chain, as well as, the fact that the supply chain is not as likely to be disrupted pending, Armageddon.
But so not a mining superpower, but you think a refining superpower? Because I'm also not sure which, and maybe this gets into sort of China in general and why China has assumed such a big role in the production of raw materials in general, because my understanding is that the reason that China has such a big role is because they were willing to refine a lot of these different metals and rare earth elements and things like that, and they were willing to do it the cheapest, and they didn't care about the environmental impact. And part of the reason China didn't have that much arable land relative to its population to begin with, but all of the rapid industrialization that China has done that has made it this real center of refining of materials everywhere is just because they were willing to refine stuff cheaply and they didn't care about the cost of the environment. And I guess to your point, on what timescale can the United States actually think about refining? So, what would it take for the United States to go after an arsenic cobalt mine in the middle of Idaho? Because I assume we don't have the technology to do that any different than the Chinese would too. So you're probably going to, poison some ski resort in Idaho if you actually want to get at the arsenic and the cobalt. So, is that, and the reason I ask is because whether it's the Trump administration or the Biden administration or everybody's talking about, nearshoring and reshoring, all these other things. Does the United States actually have the capability to do that in 5 years, in 10 years? Is that actually realistic?
So this always goes back to the question of how badly do you actually need it? We have reserves for almost every major material out there. Not as good as other parts of the world, but we've certainly got them. If we really, really want PGMs, Montana's got a great source, but you've got to work it. Now, as for the more pragmatic side of the equation, how long will it take? Between developing the technology, getting everything sorted out, life of mine, realistically, 20 to 40 years. That's kind of at the pace that these things tend to operate at. But again, if something needs to get moved in an absolute hurry, yeah, it can get done. If we think about the old copper mines in the West, the original ones, those sprang up, 2 to 5 years? Like the second they realized that it was in the ground, they go straight at it. So if you can deal with the bureaucracy, if you can deal with the local environment, make sure you're permitted, especially as one of the big ones nowadays with all the waterways. Yeah, you can get to work pretty quickly. It's just going through that process. And there are a handful of deposits that are already being demarcated, even on federal lands in some cases. It's just, you're dealing with 19th century laws in the 21st century. So there's still a disconnect that occurs.
Yeah. You said the United States almost has everything that it needs. Is there an element that stands out to you that the United States actually does not have reserves of?
Yeah, there's probably 2 or 3. One of them is tin. We don't have good tin reserves. You can make an argument for a deposit in Georgia, but it's not that great. The other one that I would say is really, really hard to get is vanadium. And if you're going to talk nuclear fusion, that's one of the metals that's required for a lot of the designs, actually. So it's actually a really interesting sticking point in some cases how we have pieces of technology, fusion, EVs, where we have the ability to get to it, but the question is on what scale, even with our own resources.
Yeah. Where I remember Miles, who's another member of our innovation advisory board that we talked about in the introduction, blew my mind about vanadium and nuclear fusion. So I at least recognize that name and kind of know what you're talking about there. Where are the world's reserves of vanadium?
Good reserves of vanadium? There's a couple in Southern Africa. That's kind of one of the major hotspots. Another one, I've read reports of some vanadium in the Ural Mountains in Siberia. Vanadium's a bit of a tricky one.
Yeah, and probably the application is probably very far in the future too.
Yeah, well, so that's the thing too. Some of these more exotic ones are co-deposits. And so when you go after one metal, it's actually a byproduct of another in some cases. So, your iridium for your proton exchange membrane hydrogen cells, you never mine for iridium. You actually have to mine for platinum, and the iridium comes with it. Same with the rhodium and the palladium. Very, very rarely do you actually go after those metals, if at all.
Getting a little more nitty gritty. You're in this space, so your money is where your mouth is to a certain extent. And I just wondered, when you think about sort of the energy sources that you guys are going to use to do refining or exploration or any of the things that you guys are doing on a daily basis, are you guys seeing a shift to renewables? Are you still on hydrocarbons? Like how does energy supply and security translate to what you guys are doing on a nitty gritty level? Yeah.
So in that particular case, so right now we have to rely on grid power. It's a function of where we're at. You can, in principle, get green energy contracts. It's hard to have traceability of those. But our long-term vision as a whole is to get rid of all, it's called scope 2 emissions. So, any processes directly emit carbon dioxide, and then kind of the energy that's used to feed it. And we can do that because Well, the metals that we go after, in the grand scheme of things, they're really, really small quantities compared to everything else. So for context, rare earths, you'll maybe have 50,000 tons a year of metal, including all of the, the really cheap ones, compared to steel, which is 1 billion tons a year. So you can scale things down for us to where we can get green energy contracts at a full scale facility. Now, where it really becomes a question of can you do it or not is actually the technology stack behind it. So we actually designed our technology stack to take into account the fact that we don't want to directly emit carbon. And there is a penalty you pay with it up front, but when you do all of the engineering, well, you can make up for it in other areas. And as a result, our direct system is carbon free. You can't say the same for other systems. Your coppers, your silicon, your metallurgical grade silicon, to be more specific, your steels. It's just such a large quantity that to get the required amount of green energy, you have to build a fusion reactor basically, or just a giant wind farm to keep it up. And then you're talking infrastructure, you're talking battery storage capacity. There's a whole lot of factors that go into it to where it's not just a mining question, it's not a metallurgy question, it's a whole infrastructure question.
Well, and cost-wise though, because you're outside of Boston. This didn't end up happening, but I remember when everybody was doomsday about natural gas markets, people were talking about, New England's energy grid is going to collapse. It can't possibly deal with the heating demand that's going to come this winter. Didn't come, but we have had these major spikes in energy over the past couple of years. I think that's going to continue as we move away from hydrocarbons. It's not just going to be, smoothly in a single line. We're going to have hydrocarbons one day and then we're going to go the other way. But I would imagine that those types of spikes would really compress your margins or would really affect the way that you do things. Is it cost effective for you to build your own sort of solar power installations that can power what you're doing because the grid is too unreliable or because there's too many price fluctuations, or is actually doing that because then we got to go get polysilicon from China, and the whole idea here is that we can't be dependent on China anymore. So, for better and for worse, we're stuck with the United States and its shale reserves and everything else.
Yeah, so to that extent, it really is a question of how you build your operation. There's a really great example I heard of recently. There's a couple of aluminum smelters in Germany, and Germany has a huge amount of renewable energy. But the problem is the grid isn't designed to handle those, up and down peak spikes, right? So, all of a sudden the sun starts shining on photovoltaics. You get a little ramp up and the cloud hits and then you get the ramp down. So what they're starting to do now, because these spikes can fluctuate so much, they're actually using the aluminum cells, the smelters, as kind of this buffer capacity to try to maintain load on the grid. So in that particular application, they're built into the grid because it's almost desired.
Yeah.
In contrast, for facilities out in the middle of nowhere, I've heard of some facilities with full PV. They'll heat all of their equipment. They'll try to get as much battery storage as they can to cut off the hydrocarbons. And then there's others where you design it so that the reaction and the co-generated heat is enough to actually try to operate most of the energy footprint of the plant. So there are many, many ways to approach it. It really depends on your jurisdiction and honestly who the developer is and what their philosophy is. Because at the end of the day, one of the biggest threats to any mine or smelter is license to operate, especially social license to operate. So now it is in everyone's best interest to ensure that everyone in the ecosystem is kept happy. So you may have to pay more initially, but if you get an extra 10 years of life on the back end, then that's totally worth it.
Well, this sort of leads also into the other thing I wanted to ask, which is to what extent are your ambitions contingent on U.S. government support? Is this public-private partnership, or is this just really the U.S. private sector sees an inefficiency that's going to result because of the breakdown in U.S.-China relations? To what extent is the U.S. government and U.S. government subsidies driving what's going to happen in this space?
So this is more personal opinion than anything else. Anything developed cannot have a subsidy. At the end of the day, you have to be able to stand on your own 2 feet, regardless of whether you get assistance or not, because you don't want to be tied to the whims of an administration or the whims of a zeitgeist. We're clean now, then 10 years down the road we're not clean, and then you're clean again. You have to be able to operate independent of that, and that's why the majors and these really big private miners are able to ride things out because they have found ways to achieve that level of profitability and as well the scale needed to get to that as well. But yeah, any venture moving forward, especially right now, yeah, you may get some assistance, but don't bank on it on the long term. I mean, that's one of the reasons why some of the original operations in the US didn't pan out, because they were dependent on some kind of assistance. And well, if the assistance ever leaves and you've got a full-scale operation, that well dries up really quick.
Yeah, that was one. I mean, I already alluded to the story of the rare earth metals ETF that I was told to buy. One of my first experiences of Boomtown. And I won't mention who it was, but I had a friend. I was in college at the time, and I had a friend who we were having beers at the Chapter House. Pour one out. It's since burned down in Ithaca, New York. And I told him that I was investing in some of these things in the stock market, and he actually stormed out of the bar. He said that I was a disgrace to. He's not so Marxist these days, but at the time he was particularly Marxist. Anyway. But that's neither here nor there. That's interesting because I feel like in a lot of other sectors, like there is a lot of government subsidization. I've been thinking a lot about U.S. agriculture and the relationship between biofuels and the U.S. energy mix and things like that. And that's an area where the subsidies, doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican. No Democrat or Republican wants to be the one that says, hey, we're going to take away some of these subsidies that go towards farmers or crop insurance or things like that. So it's kind of interesting to me that metals has to stand alone. And I wonder if that's just because the shortages and the price increases haven't gotten high enough yet. Like it's one thing with food. If you see the price of food double, triple at the store, like suddenly you're really worried. But I guess, you don't eat your iPhone. You don't eat some of the things that have rare elements into it. And I guess you're just accustomed to electronics and fancy things going up. But I would assume that over time that people are going to be more willing to sacrifice their principles for just having access to these raw materials if things continue to go the way that they're going.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point you bring up, because if steel stops tomorrow, right, you're not going to have, a famine per se. There will be long-reaching consequences of it, but it takes time to get there, and maybe you can mitigate that, maybe you can ride that out. Similar for copper, right? Prices of copper go up. Oh no, well, I'm still probably going to build that house anyways. It's not an immediate gut punch. The ones who really do feel it are the industrials. Now, if jobs start being threatened, okay, that's a bit of a different scenario. But typically speaking, there's just enough buffer capacity to keep things afloat. And thinking forward, right, going back to this idea of electrification, that's all it is. It's an idea. If it doesn't happen, well, okay, I mean, people are pretty comfy with the status quo. As if you can deny giving me something, but you can't take away something that I already have, is the way I like to think about it. Yeah. So if you think about metals and metals and kind of the materials commodities that way, it's okay if I don't get an iPhone 15 or 2000. It's a bit more of a problem if you take away the one I currently have. So with regards to that, unless it becomes something truly technologically enhancing, then people I've found are a little bit more flexible with it. That being said, though, the demand for certain materials right now is just outright astronomical, and the projections are borderline ludicrous. So if you want to accept the projections that already exist, let's look at the 2050 scenario, right? So 2050, we want to cut all our CO2 out. For me, copper's the big metric, because copper is a material that it's on the cheaper side. It's got more of an open market, and there is enough tonnage of it to where the shady stuff associated with some of the smaller quantity materials is generally avoided. put general in quotes. Geopolitics and all sorts of global events can change that on a dime. But so right now, we produce about 25 million tons a year, 25 million metric tons, right? And by 2035, projections have us at 50 million, okay? And then if you look at the 2050 projection, we require 1.4 billion tons of copper to reach our electrification goals. To put that into context, we've mined 750 million tons of copper in human history. So that means in the next roughly 30 years, we have to mine double the amount of copper that we've mined over the course of human history. Those numbers are pretty jarring when you hear them for the first time and you have a bit of context.
Well,
can we do it?
Well, can we? Yeah, I mean, because what little I know about I know some things about copper because I've had positions there before. I mean, the ore quality in the mines that do exist has been declining for a long time. So, like you can't really, and there aren't new mines necessarily that are going to come on. And we can debate when we think the structural shortage is going to come into place. I've sort of been thinking 2026 is the year that it's going to happen. And so I'm sort of speculatively looking always at copper futures. And so is this the moment where we start to tip and where the narrative starts to shift? But I mean, can we? Can we do what you just described?
Oh yeah. I mean, the material's in the ground. It's gonna be a pain to get to all of it, but if we really want to, we can do it. What the question I always like to pose to everyone though is, how do we do it, right? Because again, a mine, fine. You take your 10, 15 years, you get that sorted out, and then you just start hauling material out of that ground as fast as you can. It's the refining that's going to be the hard part. In the US, we've got 3 smelters left. They're all pretty old at this point. There's the Hayden smelter, the Kennecott smelter, the Miami smelter. Mm-hmm. And that's it. Everything else we export. So again, going back to the idea of critical materials, like, well, we've got it, but we're all shipping it out. Okay, so now you come back and you say, what would it take to mine copper in a manner that we are willing to deal with, and also in a manner that's profitable? And so this goes back to your idea of subsidies as well. Like, okay, you might have something to help you get off the ground. I cannot deny that. A little bit of help, especially in capital-intensive industries, goes a long way. But being able to stand on your own 2 feet, once they pull out the supports from under you, you have to be ready from day one. But on the plus side, the demand projections just keep going up and up and up. And I mean, the number of companies now who are looking to directly buy materials where that was not the previous precedent is really fascinating at the moment.
Well, and I guess on the nature of what you're doing, you think it's going to happen in the United States. But I mean, do you think that the United States is going to, like, let's imagine the United States in 2033. Is there going to be 15 copper smelters? Is there going to be some new technology that we finally advance from the Romans into the medieval period? Like, how are we going to do it? Or are we just going to farm it out to other countries in the world and say, yeah, we don't want to do it here. We can just refine it where it's mined in strategic places like Democratic Republic of Congo, which apparently has overtaken Peru as the second largest copper exporter in the world.
Yes.
What is that going to look like?
It's likely going to be a mix of the two, because there's some stuff that's pretty low value. Fine, you'll offshore that. Let's call a spade. But there is other stuff, especially when it has political import of some kind or some strategic value. They want to keep that there. So the process for making semiconductor grade silicon is an absolute mess. But if you want to have a steady supply of this stuff and you want to keep it with all of the bright trade secrets so that you can be the one to make the semiconductors, yeah, you'll bring that in-house. Mm-hmm. It's always a question of, what are you willing to give away because you think that the economic value is worth it? And then what do you need to keep because it provides you with a technological moat of some kind? Mm-hmm. So to go to a logical extreme, think about uranium mining and refining. That's kept top secret, lock and key, but it doesn't actually make you a whole heck of a lot of money.
Right.
But the strategic importance in that particular case is completely worth keeping all that in-house.
Yeah. I know you have a hard stop at the top of the hour, so I'll just ask one more question and make you promise to come on again, because this has been very high level and something that I'm just starting to get to know. But we've talked a little bit about the global geography of metals and mineral supply chains and things like that. And as we talk specifically about the United States, I wanted to talk about the internal geography of these things, because you're obviously outside of Boston. But what states do you think are most friendly towards welcoming these types of industries within them? Do you think that there are regions or parts of the United States that are going to be leaders here versus regions that are not going to? What areas are more friendly from that perspective?
Yeah, great question. Rule of thumb, the Western U.S. is where you're going to see a lot of this development. If my recollection is right, you can mine on federal land. There's a permitting process. There's some hoops you have to jump through, but there is a process that is established and well known at this point. Well, most federal lands are actually out there. Okay. On top of that, the deposits are just better out there. Not for everything, but for the stuff that we really want right now, all your good copper deposits, all your good lithium deposits, probably everything with the exception of your nickel is all found out there at this point. So states like Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, those are the places that you probably look to if you're going to open a mine of some type. In terms of the refinery, that's a little bit trickier. I'm a little bit of a contrarian where I think the Midwest actually may see a lot of that return there. If you look really carefully, you'll still find a handful of mills and smelters. They make specialty materials, but all of the equipment is there and the know-how is there. And those two things are something that are basically indispensable in this industry, no matter what material you choose. So if you've already got the equipment and you've got a serviceable workforce who knows how to maybe not do the exact same equipment, but something similar enough, then that's a much easier lift.
And then why are you based in Massachusetts?
Because I met my co-founders here, and MIT and Harvard are down the street. Candidly, operations will not be here. Never say never, but statistically speaking, they're not going to be here. But we're looking for a final site to actually get to commercialization. And again, it's kind of on those principles. As weird as it sounds, is there a workforce who's willing to work with these materials and things? Do you have the infrastructure? Do you have zoning and governance? I mean, there's some towns in Massachusetts where on a municipal level, you cannot run anything that makes iron because there's an anti-iron works stipulation still on the books from, the 1800s.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I said this on Twitter actually this week, where, the geopolitics between nations is fascinating and it's what I do for a living. But in some ways, I find the geopolitics in nations themselves, the geographic distributions inside of a particular country more interesting. And the United States seems to have this pattern over and over again where, and I'm not saying this from an ideological perspective, but if you look at, the coastal areas are where people are probably most ideological about sustainability and ESG and governance and things like that. And they just expect that these materials that are going to create these electric cars that are going to make them feel good about themselves are just going to drop into their laps, that everything's going to be fine. But all of this stuff comes from somewhere. So you can get it from child labor in Democratic Republic of Congo, or it can be sourced from the Midwest. I'm here in Louisiana where, they're killing the shoreline just to get natural gas and all these different chemicals out and things like that. And I just don't think there's this really good, it's one of the, and this is true in many, many countries. We're talking about the United States right now, but the coast and the interior of the country don't seem to understand that they both need each other and that neither can have their goals met without each other. And this has played out, multiple times over U.S. history, and we've always seemed to sort of get to some point of it. But it seems to me with this particular issue, it's going to be there again, because there is this political urgency and sense of we want sustainability and governance, and no real equivalent sense of, well, what does that actually mean? What is, as you said, for what was it, 1 pound of hydrocarbons is 6 pounds of these metals? So there's going to be an upfront environmental cost if you do want to decarbonize. Is that actually worth it? Nobody's actually having those types of conversations, right? It's all just kind of ideological mumbo jumbo coming out of Washington.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll throw on my hat with one more thought as well. Very simply, that when we as a group of people really, really want something, we will find a way to achieve it. But to get to that, we have to have a consensus, to your point, first. And can we reinvent how mining is done, how metallurgy is done? Absolutely. You know, if we look over the course of human history, you see the Industrial Revolution, you see the atomic age spring to life in just a decade or two. These things happen on very, very short timescales and have huge ramifications. So if it's something that we as a group of people collectively say, yeah, we're going to figure this out, I have no doubt that with the right individuals, with the right leadership, this can be done. But we just got to get to that consensus and that starting point. And then the rest will take care of itself.
Yeah, no, I mean, I hate to close on a pessimistic note, but I feel like we're nowhere close to that consensus. And I feel like this is one area where authoritarian governments have an edge up on democracies. I think democracies will create the new technology, to your point, but it's authoritarian governments that can say, we don't care about your ski resort. We're going to mine that cobalt right then and there because we need it.
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, you can look at China. You can look at the way that some South American countries like Chile and Argentina developed their mineral reserves under the governments from the past 100 years. And yeah, you're absolutely right. But at a certain point, I think enough will be enough. And I think people will have to start agreeing upon, you know, okay, we're going to have to do something about this.
Well, I hope that moment comes soon. Tomás, thanks for coming on, and thanks for making the time, and we'll have you back on soon, okay?
Yep, appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.